The Bolshevik takeover of power from provisional government led by Kerensky in October-November 1917 marked the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution. It was driven by the agenda of saving the revolutionary momentum that had been generated by the abdication of the Tsar in February 1917 and the developments that followed thereafter. The October Revolution of 1917, however, was not to close right away because the revolution, properly speaking, unfolded over the next 2 years in course of what we speak of as first the Red-Green Civil War and then the Red-White Civil War. The Bolshevik takeover of power was not an act of revolution by itself. It merely marked the beginning of a transformation that we speak of as the Russian Revolution. When the Bolsheviks took power on the night of October 24th, 25th, 1917 by the old calendar, the features that we customarily associate with the Bolshevik Revolution did not come into being overnight. There was no nationalization of all industrial or all agricultural units of production. Not even all financial institutions were taken over. By the first decree of October 25th, only the larger banks were nationalized by the Bolsheviks in order to give the government the financial resources that were needed to run the state. Further, there were no immediate attempts at nationalizing all agricultural estates, nor even an agenda was pushed forth right away about nationalizing all agricultural estates and then redistributing them. Although these were revolutionary agendas which were very much in the forefront, it was never really allowed to dominate the decisions right away. Even more significantly, the principal distinctive claim of the Bolsheviks, or principal distinctive slogan of the Bolsheviks, was an end to the war right away. That also did not happen. What happened in the first month from October 1917 to, let's say, the end of November 1917 was a gradual takeover of power by the Bolsheviks using merely the instruments that were already at hand. It was also driven by the concern of stabilizing the country from both the forces of counter-revolution led by the monarchists with forces stationed primarily in the south and in Siberia led by people like General Yudenich. On the other hand was, of course, the forces of revolution who were disagreeing with the Bolsheviks on the manner of the seizure of power. These were people who wanted the thing to be done constitutionally using the Constitutional Assembly, which was supposed to be convened in January 1918. So the first month was basically used by the Bolsheviks to stabilizing both the fronts. There was no immediate end drawn to the war, but negotiations were indeed opened. The first major change that we see in this drift comes in December 1917, because once the Bolsheviks realized that there was going to be no easy pacification with the other forces of revolution, they wanted to bring over a part of the Russian countryside, at least to their side. So the Bolsheviks, who were left with only one ally in the ARC, the All Russia Congress of Soviets, the left SRs, wanted to push for the land reforms with the left, which the left SRs had been demanding from the list of 1905. The Land Reform Code that was initiated in December 1917 was, however, not speaking of nationalizing all agricultural resources. What it did instead was to declare socialization of all resources. In other words, land would go to he who tills it. It was the tiller who was to become the owner of the soil. So rather than landlords on the one hand or the state on the other, which was to take place in the 1930s under collectivization, the Land Reform Code simply was making the land over to those who were actually tilling the thing. And this accentuated the rate at which soldiers were returning home from the front line. This was a tendency that had emerged once the discussion had begun about redistribution of land. Once the Land Reform Code of December was promulgated, soldiers left in droves from the front line, and that necessarily weakened Russian military defenses on the Western Front. The pressure began to mount on the military, and at this stage, the Russian military began to break with the provisional government after having gone along with it for a long time, or rather break with the Petrograd Soviet after having accepted much of the developments that had gone on between October and November. With people like Yudenich and Wrangel leaving away from the front in order to bring down the Bolsheviks, by February 1918, the Bolshevik faction was under tremendous pressure to hold its own in the domestic sector itself. As a result, despite major differences even within the Bolshevik party, Lenin managed to push through a successful conclusion of a very humiliating treaty with the Germans, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. By the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia pulled itself out of the Great War. In return, Germany stopped all military operations against her. Russia was pulling out from Poland and the Baltic states, and was even willing to give up any direct control over Ukraine, and Ukraine was allowed to go its own separate way. The purpose was that with the front line collapsing, a negotiated peace was better than a total and abject surrender. And the Germans, who were keen on relocating on the Western Front, on the German Western Front, were happy to let go, even though they pushed through a very harsh peace. But once the Brest-Litovsk Treaty was signed and the need for war was no longer there, the total fragmentation of the former Russian military elite was envisaged. And those who were opposed to the Bolsheviks now had a double reason to do so. So Yudenich and Wrangel moved south and moved to Siberia, and Kolchak, who was already there in Siberia, they began to close ranks, and there was an anti-Bolshevik, a pro-monarchy military faction that had begun to emerge around this time. Kolchak, Yudenich, Wrangel, they all were beginning to court support of those forces in the countryside, which had become active in the month of September-October 1917 as well, in their resistance to land reforms. And these forces favoring the monarchists, teaming up with those who were opposed to land reforms, began to constitute the front line that we speak of as the Whites in the Civil War. The White standing for the flag of the Romanov dynasty. The problem with the Bolsheviks was actually much more complicated.